The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Ann Devane. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office, and my guest today is the author of Female Rage. Ann Devane is a specialist in American literature and culture and has lectured on women, myth, and popular culture, and has produced numerous pieces for public television. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We're glad to have you with us on this election day of 1994. You've arranged your book patterned after the Medusa myth. Tell me a little bit about how you came to connect myth and female rage.
I think one of the watershed moments was the movie Fatal Attraction. And when we started talking about our own rage, that is my co-author and I, we talked about our own rage, and we talked with women in our classes, and we talked with our friends. Over and over they came up with this idea of Medusa, and they always came back to that film saying, doesn't Glenn Close look like Medusa? Medusa's the scariest woman in the world. She has snakes for hair, and she has a gaze that will turn everyone to stone. Very threatening individual. And we said, but we knew, because we had taught myth in our courses, in culture, discussions of literature and culture, that Medusa's story is not just that she was a monster. She was a very beautiful woman. She was a priestess of Athena. And she was playing by the rules, and she was being as good as she should be. But she was raped by Zeus, and Athena punished her and made her a monster. And Medusa was so saddened and enraged and afraid that people would see her, people that she loved would see her, that she flew away to this deserted island where she spent her life in rage. Because she was such a scary figure, however, she became the challenge for all the young warriors. And it was Perseus who said that he would go and he would bring back the head of the Gorgon, because Medusa was the only one of the Gorgons who was mortal. And so the story has been told from Perseus' point of view. He cuts off Medusa's head, and then he uses her powers to kill his enemies. And we said, this is an interesting story, because women look at the face of Medusa and men look at the face of Medusa, and they're afraid. They're afraid of a woman not being pretty and being angry, and the combination is very potent. And so we took her story and that image as a way, as a kind of a touchstone for women's rage and how they feel about themselves and the way they look.
And isn't it interesting that she was raped, but she was blamed and she was punished?
I think what's very interesting there is that Athena, who punished her, did not have a mother, and was proud of the fact that she did not have a mother. She sprang full-blown from the head of Zeus, so she always identified herself with men. We call that in the book a man's woman instead of a woman's woman. And there are lots of examples of that. I think the women who testified on behalf of Clarence Thomas and against Anita Hill were showing us a kind of Athena response. And we have to look carefully at the ways in which we use our rage at other women, because it becomes all too convenient.
And now we have actually two women looking at Anita Hill, again, two journalists who are looking at her, and maybe some female rage is coming through that writing process.
That's exactly right. It will be interesting to see the final product there and what that particular take is. There was lots of female rage in watching those events on TV, because many women felt exclusion rage, that the Senate committee was all male. Mm-hmm. But then there was another kind of rage when they watched these women effectively sort of undermine or sabotage or attack Anita Hill personally, and try to discredit her, and women viewing this felt that there wasn't much solidarity for women's problems and validation of women and their feelings.
And the obvious fact that she immediately was not believed, whereas a man was believed.
Oh, yes.
Even though perhaps nobody will ever know except the two of them.
Yes, absolutely. But the fact that she did not lose her head. She sat there rather regally, calmly, extraordinarily articulate, and she refused to get involved in the war of the words of the tabloids afterwards. And that gave her enormous credibility, with women especially.
Medusa exiled herself on the island. Does women's rage tend to isolate them?
It does. Women and men are afraid of rage. And there are interesting reactions to that word. Most people think of it as something negative. But the fact is that we all have rage, and it's an important tool, and it tells us when we're being threatened, when our self or our viability as our self is being threatened. Women, however, are brought up never to express strong emotions, that anger or rage is just not nice. And we are taught to be good and be polite and be calm and be a lady. And men are brought up with a sense of entitlement. They can take up their space in the world. They can express their emotions more freely than we can. So women are programmed, I think, with the training that to express strong emotions means you'll be punished in some way. Therefore, better to keep it down. A very good friend of mine told me that she was brought up in a house where the word anger was not allowed. You could say you were disappointed. You could say you were hurt. But you could not say I was angry, and you couldn't express anger. She said, and I've never felt entitled to be angry. So she's kept it all inside of her, as women do, and we call it other names. We call it being hurt, feeling bad. We call it being out of sorts. We call it depression. And what we do is have this storehouse of rage until finally it has to have some kind of release. One woman's story that we tell is exploding into peptic ulcers and nearly taking her life. Other women have, emotional breakdowns. Other women, unfortunately, reach this sort of boiling point where the lid is blown off and their rage erupts violently. We have all too many of those tragic stories.
And as we speak, here in November '94, Susan Smith, who allegedly murdered her 2 children.
That's right. And what's so troubling about that is that our first reaction is, this is so horrible. It's a horrible tragedy. How could a mother kill her children? And we talk about it in the book as one of the, when you don't understand rage, very often women will adopt one of 2 solutions. The Medea solution, which is the case of Susan Smith here, where you lash out and punish other people and you displace your rage. Or the Hemlock solution, where you commit suicide. What's interesting is that in the birth of female rage, which is the first stage that we talk about our development as children, one of the things that little girls learn is that they are dependent upon their father for approval, and they seek his approval. And that if a father leaves, then they are denied that love. And it's a primary wound for them. It's abandonment. Susan Smith's father, the sheriff tells us, committed suicide when she was a young girl. So he effectively abandoned her, at least in the child's mind. He did, and by choice. And now when she's in a relationship with a man who says, I want you, but not your children, or that's what she hears him saying, then here is that terror of abandonment again. Clearly she was not enraged at her children, and clearly she also had, and still does, have thoughts of suicide. But this is what happens when we keep it inside and it's unacknowledged and we're afraid of rage. Rage shouldn't be a sort of backseat driver that says, go left, go right, and everything is very chaotic. It should be a passenger in the front seat where we say, okay, what do you think? Should I take this road or should I not? And make a friend of it. It really is enormously teaching aid and a healing power.
One of the most important things I think that I learned from reading the book was that everybody experiences rage many times in their life, but we need to stop and avoid acting out that rage impulsively and think about how we could act it out constructively. And as I say it, I think it sounds easy, but I know it's very difficult, especially in those times when rage is triggered and it causes almost an automatic, impulsive kind of reaction.
And I think it will do that the deeper the rage trigger is buried. We all respond to different stimuli. And as women, we will have different rage triggers. Maybe our primary rage trigger is at work, difficulties there, or maybe in family dynamics with our family of origin. It may be in a marriage. It may be in any number of different ways. The deeper it's buried, the longer a history we have with that particular issue, the harder it will be not to act impulsively. But if we act impulsively and we don't think about what we want and all of our options, that it's not going to lead us to validating ourselves and taking responsibility for it. The first thing we have to do is say, it's perfectly normal, it's perfectly natural, and it's telling me who I am, so I have to acknowledge it. To acknowledge it, we have to feel it. What is your rage trigger? I'll give you an example. I take my car in for servicing, and the mechanic.
That's a rage trigger, right?
It certainly is. And the serviceman talks to me as though, you know, I'd never heard of a timing belt or I'd never looked under the hood of a car, without finding out if I had, as though we were speaking in a foreign language. And I feel nervous. I feel anxious or something. That's a sign that my body is telling me I'm threatened in some way. Then we have to say, okay, what's the threat here? Well, the threat is that he is sort of dismissing me just because of my gender. I'm no more than just my gender right now. And I know that's not true. And I say, okay, have I ever felt that way before? Yeah, I did. I remember when I was young, my father saying to me and my mother saying to me, you were supposed to be a boy. You know, you weren't supposed to be what you are. You're supposed to be a boy. So the male model of development was the approved one, and somehow always felt that I was sort of being erased or dismissed because I was female. Well, you see, that takes a lot of work. If I get upset when people threaten me just because they're judging me on the basis of gender, that is deep-seated. It goes way back to childhood. That kind of understanding doesn't happen overnight. We have to work on that. So this isn't a quick fix for that, but it's a way of getting at that. We'll get to, and therapists tell us over and over again, that we start with anger, and then underneath the anger is the rage, and the rage will really tell us who we are. But we have to feel it. Does it feel like a punch in the stomach? Does it feel as though our veins are boiling? We could talk about our blood boiling. Do we see red? Do we get all agitated? Is our breathing shorter and more shallow? Listen to our bodies, because where it's happening, if we don't acknowledge it, that's where we're going to store our rage. And if we store it too long, it'll blow up.
You used Jean Harris as an example of a woman whose rage did explode, actually internally, because she was trying to commit suicide, but yet turned it in the end into a rich and productive life when she was in prison.
Her story, and so many of the stories of the women who talk to us, and really public figures as well, women we all know, Tina Turner and Oprah Winfrey, and many people, many women are able to do this. Jean Harris is a particularly interesting case, I think, because there was that celebrated murder, and as intelligent a woman as she was, as rational as a woman she was, it was that sense of exclusion, it was that betrayal by him of her. And betrayal is the heart of rage. When we expect that something will happen or that we are in a relationship, there's a certain kind of contract, and then we are betrayed, whether it's at work or whatever. But here was this normally rational, this very intelligent woman shooting someone. And that's, you see, the moment when it explodes. And then what do? Well, your life can be over with, or you could go on. And she learned by listening to her body. She had problems with her heart. She was put into an environment in prison that was totally unlike anything in her life, and yet became a model of compassion and teaching and nurturing of young women who were very, very different from her in many ways, but similar in that they also had experienced rage. Mm-hmm. And she really is a model of how to turn that around once you understand it, and refuse to let those lapses defeat us completely. We have to learn from rage.
I was reading an article recently, a magazine article about Lorena Bobbitt, and it said an interesting thing, I thought, that when women read about the Lorena Bobbitt case, they tend to smile. When men read about it, they're very nervous. Once again, is it that stare that turns men to stone?
Well, I think that case is very interesting because it was tied to sexuality, as is Medusa's myth, as was Anita Hill's story, as was Alex Forrest in Fatal Attraction. And I do think that that women feel punished for their sexuality. You're not supposed to be too sexy. You're not supposed to be too bright. You're not to be too intimidating in any way.
But you're not supposed to be too unsexy either.
That's right. And so we're caught in this bind of expectations that's impossible to meet. But what's interesting is when women read, or when people read the story of Medusa, men smile because the warrior has conquered the great monster, and women feel nervous. Lorena Bobbitt's story is the story in reverse. And it makes men uncomfortable because men have told the stories, have had control of the images. The person who controls the image controls the perception. Now, this is not a male-bashing book, and the relationships between men and women are only one chapter of the book, as you know. But many men have read this and have talked to us about female rage and find that they could start exploring their own rage, but more important than that, they could start communicating honestly with the women that they love who are afraid to express their rage. One man told me on the airplane the other night, he said, "I wish I had your book before my wife died as a complete depressed alcoholic because she would never get angry or say what she wanted." Men want us to be viable, alive, confident, assertive women. And we can't do that if we don't take responsibility for our own feelings. It's not up to men to solve this for us. Nothing is going to change unless we change it.
Is assertiveness an antidote for rage, do you
It
think?
certainly can be. If you realize why you are stuffing it down and denying your rage, some women will tell me, "I never feel rage. I'm not enraged at all." And I'll talk to them for 10 minutes and I'll know 2 or 3 rage triggers of them. We don't want to deny the feeling. It's very good. We want to control the response. But if we stuff it down through a compulsive eating or anorexia or bulimia, or we become control freaks or whatever, we're not going to be aware of what we're feeling. We're not going to be aware of what our options are. And we can't act decisively unless we know what our options are. We need to step out of the rage experience. The more powerful it is, the more important it is to step out of it, because rage is a mind-body experience, and you get caught up in it, and it blocks out everything else. You can't be rational in many ways if you are in a full-blown rage experience. So you have to cut yourself out of that and say, all right, let me feel it. Where is it in my body? What is the threat to me? Why do I feel threatened by this? How can I eliminate or neutralize this threat? What do I want out of this? For example, if someone takes responsibility for something that you've done at work, and it's your credit really, and does this in public, and you get enraged because you're being marginalized or you're being made to feel invisible here. You say, why do I feel that way? Well, because it doesn't validate my work and my abilities. Okay, what can you do? You have lots of options. You can yell and scream at the person. You can go behind the person's back and try to attack them and seek some kind of revenge on some sort of level of discrediting them. Those aren't very productive. You could think about what you need. You could say, how important is this to me? Should I deal with the person individually? Do I want an apology from that person? Is that enough? Do I want a public announcement, apology, at least to the people who are listening? What do I want? What's going to make me feel right about this?
And then deal directly with that person.
And deal directly with that. Many women say, oh, well, you know, I'm just a doormat. I'm just this, I'm just that. As though they're always apologizing for themselves. But late at night when they've put everybody to bed and they've done the dishes, they feel pretty lousy about that. And they say, why do I do this? One woman told me that she was the kind of person that let everybody in front of her in the grocery store. She had the week's shopping, and if they only had 2 or 3 items, oh, go ahead of me. No, that's all right. Go ahead of me. She said, I get to the car and I feel terrible because I have other things to do. I'm late for my child's, dance appointment. She said, why do I do that? And I said, why do you think that you always have to be good? We have to be nice. That's what we're supposed to be as women. So one day after she'd worked on this, she said to me, Anne, you won't believe it. She said, I was in the grocery store the other day. I had a huge wagon full of of groceries, done all my shopping, and I didn't even ask her to, but a woman stepped in front of me and said, I've only got a few items. And I said, yes, that's true, but I've got a really hectic schedule this afternoon, and I've got to get out of here quickly. Would you mind going to the back of the line? She said, I felt fantastic. She said, I could do it again, and I think maybe I could even take on a bigger problem.
And probably learned that it didn't ruin the other person either.
That's right. And the woman just said, oh, okay. And it wasn't, no one thought she was terrible because she said, gee, I really need to get in line, get my groceries through and keep my schedule today. And she said, it's wonderful to know that you are in charge of your feelings and you can decide what's best for you. And you don't have to feel bad and carry that around with you saying, I'm a bad person because I let everybody take advantage of me. But you can say, hey, it feels good to establish boundaries. This is important, and that's what rage does. It tells us where our boundaries are, what people can and can't do to us or with us that will make us feel lousy.
As you were talking, I thought about in my own childhood, my father came about it in kind of a different way and really praised me and affirmed me for being such a good girl and never making any trouble for anyone. And in some ways, that's a harder thing to overcome because he did it in a positive way that made me feel good at the time. Mm-hmm. And I can really relate to letting other people go ahead and
and I think until we really re-examine the way in which female children are brought up, I'm afraid those two models, the sort of good girl in training or princess in training as opposed to the tomboy, I think the tomboy does have the advantage because at least she learns those assertive ways of dealing with life, whereas the good little girl believes that, eventually, well, yes, she can go to college, she can develop her mind, but eventually she'll get married and life will be wonderful. And as we all know, marriage isn't utopia. And so then there's a sense of betrayal. Oh, I thought if I was just good enough and pleasing enough and pretty enough and accommodating enough, that everything would be okay and I would be rewarded and people would think I was a good person and I would be taken care of and my life would be wonderful. And when it's not, as it never is, then we feel betrayed by that. And then we have to dig back into the past and say, well, why did this happen?
How often do you think that women's unrealistic expectations of marriage are responsible for their rage?
Oh, it's a very high percentage, I think.
And is it changing? Are women beginning to think more equally about their marriage responsibilities?
I think many are, and many of the young women that I talk to are. But women in their 30s are in a particular bind because they may have a career established, they may be very committed to their career, and yet they very much want a home life, or they very much want children. And again, they're caught in this bind of, well, I'm trying to have it all. And of course, I always say the problem is we do have it all, and that accounts for a lot of rage. But I think that if a woman feels, we talk about the biological clock and all that, if she feels pressured that there's only a limited amount of time in which to make a union and have a family, then she might very well regress to the kinds of unrealistic expectations that we find in so many of these romantic movies, for example. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's quite a dilemma.
In the book, you tell us that there is a secret of female rage and that there is power in female rage. What's the secret and what's the power?
Well, there are many.
In other words, tell us about the whole book.
Yeah, in 25
sense,
words
yes.
or less, right? Well, I think that one of the things that's kept secret is that it is not poison; it is power.
After all, Medusa's snakes had healing fluid.
That's right. They had healing fluids, and when her head was placed in seawater, it turned those seaweeds to coral. Women discover their creativity through their rage. Rage is liberating. It could be the most freeing thing for us if we learn to feel it and acknowledge it, confront it, and act on it. And it is terribly powerful. So many women who tell us, once I had this sort of click experience that told me who I was and what I must do. That was my rage, and it is my friend, and now I consult it and I keep it my friend. Medusa's not a scary woman. She's a beautiful woman. She was turned into a scary woman because of trespasses and violations against her. And that's the secret. We don't have to punish ourselves or anybody else because of what has happened to us. It's our responsibility to recover ourselves and to act on ourselves. We've all got everything that we need in us. We have to rediscover it and retell the story from Medusa's point of view instead of from Perseus' point of view.
Uh-huh. There's one more big concept that we need to cover in just a few minutes, and that is, are we allowing rage to justify violence, as in the Menendez brothers case, and as we talked about before, Susan Smith and Lorena Bobbitt. And as a matter of fact, recently I heard on TV that a governor was commuting the sentences of some women that were earlier convicted of murdering their husbands because they were battered women. And a prominent attorney, Dershowitz, who has written a book called Abuse Excuse.
Mm-hmm. It's very difficult, isn't it? I think that this cult of victimization that we seem to have in this country now, where everything, the most heinous crimes, are explained away by I was victimized when I was a child. And when we have less and less of a tolerance for that. What was interesting in Lorena Bobbitt's case was that the law said that was there an impulsive moment, or I forget exactly how the law framed it, but their definition of it was our definition of rage. That the women whose sentences have been commuted, many times that moment was a moment when they were not rational because of this storehouse of rage having been built up. But that is never an excuse. I cannot excuse murdering anyone. I cannot excuse cutting off a man's penis. I cannot excuse murdering my 2 children. Those are actions that we have to take responsibility for, and we have to pay the consequences for them. Between being a victim and being a vigilante, though, there is middle ground, and it's up to us. I don't excuse my present behavior by saying, oh, but my mother said something awful to me when I was 5. I'm a big girl now, and it's up to me to direct my life, not the past, not the rage that's sitting in the back seat. Up here as a friend saying, okay, enough is enough. We have to start with me and my life.
There's a wonderful quote at the end of your book that I want to read so that I have it correctly, and it was very insightful for me. At the end of the book, you say that letting go of rage begins when a woman defangs the snakes in her life by seeing them as flawed human beings sent to teach her important lessons. And I'm afraid now that one of the important lessons we have to learn is that time is up. But I love the quote, and I thank you for the book.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being with us.
Wonderful to be here.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.